I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door, which no one is able to shut. I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. So I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. Can we just spend a few minutes talking about that idea? So, Jerry, maybe I'll throw to you on this to get a little bit of a thought here, but you mentioned encouraging people who feel weak, who feel insignificant, who feel small. That's exactly what Jesus is doing here. Just give us some thoughts about weakness, insignificance, those kinds of feelings that we might struggle with.
Yeah, don't you think Alan McCannon would take us right to 2 Corinthians 12? And I think it'd be worth turning there. This is certainly a verse that we have talked about often. Pastor Lee was talking about how he came to love the idea of God being sovereign when we're talking about God's sovereignty over trials. And remember, Paul in verse 12:9 says, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient. After he pleads 3 times with the Lord to take that the thorn. Let me start in 7. So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, and don't you love this? God did something better than take away the thorn in the side. What's better? This is better. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest on me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Don't you think Philadelphia probably felt like that? They probably felt weak, it sounds like. And yet, that's when we're closest to the Lord so often. So I just think it's flooded with application, isn't it, for us? That we say, oftentimes, none of us really like feeling weak. I know I don't, and I don't think anybody really does. But that's when God's grace is going to be sufficient, and we will really shine more brightly for the sake of the gospel.
I think too, like, and we've kind of hinted at this, like we have to kind of redefine what we think by strength and weakness, because we live in a world in which strength is often thought of, solely in physical terms, like I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I can do more because might makes right, only the strong survive, and I mean there's wisdom in saying, physical strength and that kind of stuff, but it's like in God's way of thinking about things, in God's economy of virtues, if you will, it's not just the raw display of physical ability, it's actually meekness, which is power under control. It's not saying we strive to be as weak as we can physically, but it's saying whatever strength God has given us, we use in a way that honors and pleases Him. Whether or not the world approves of that. And so we don't need to think of meekness as weakness. I mean, that's you've probably heard that before. It's very cliche, but using your strength to serve others is actually the most God-honoring thing you can do. To build others up, not puff yourself up, not build yourself up, but to serve and build others up. I think that's the truest use of strength that honors the Lord. And when we do that, if you've tried to serve others in any capacity for any length of time, I mean, there is a very, very big joyful element to it, but sometimes people are people and they can be hard, and you realize, Lord, I can't do this without your help. And so, I'm not going to remember the reference, but it talks about serving the strength that God supplies. And so we use what God gives us for the good and the benefit of others, and that way God gets the glory and we're not taking it to ourselves. And so weakness, like spiritual weakness, is a sign of that, I would say, is actually when you're trying to use your gifts to benefit yourself and build yourself up at the expense of other people. That's actually not strength, that's weakness. And we always have to evaluate our hearts and our motivations in that. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Is it to make me look good? Or is it to make Jesus look good? Is it to build me up, or is it to build others up? And so, that might not be absolutely related to what they're doing here in Philadelphia, but I think it is at least a little bit, in terms of like the world looking at them, they're not much to look at. But Jesus has nothing, no rebuke for them. Like they're doing what they're supposed to be doing in a way that pleases him. And so that's, from a worldly perspective, they're weak, but from a spiritual perspective, it seems like they get that Jesus is their strength, and that's the way it should be.
And closer to John the Baptist, let me decrease, let him increase. That's what you see these, instead of the two churches that the Lord has nothing good to say, it seems like it's let me increase, let him decrease. So we can be backwards on that so often.
Yeah. And I think that for probably every one of us, at least it's true for me, it's probably true for most of us, we can see areas of real weakness in our life. I mean, in terms of limitation of abilities in certain areas, right? There's all kinds of limitations on what you're good at, what you're even able to do well, and it can be a source of tremendous frustration in life. Because you're like, man, I really wish I had more of this natural ability or that natural ability. Just like for me, if I had a much stronger memory, it would save me so much time with preparation and stuff. Stuff would just stick. It's like the Velcro is wearing off. You put it there, it just falls off. And you're like, come on, I learned this 6 months ago. I have to relearn it now because it's just, so I struggle sometimes. I wish my memory was really strong and I could hold on to all this stuff. So whatever it may be, you've got these limitations and they drive you, they make you feel your limits, your weaknesses. Instead of being tempted to doubt God's sovereignty and how he made you, which is what we're tempted to do, which is to say, God, you made a mistake. Well, we got a little rain coming. Instead of that, I think that we need to learn to what Paul does here, which is to turn to the Lord and say, God, you made me this way exactly as you intended. There's no mistake. There's no problem here. And in my limitations, I'm going to have an ability to show your strength and your power in a way that I wouldn't if I was more competent naturally in these things. So I'll allow your natural inabilities to be places where you rely on God especially, like all the more, and allow God's strength to be poured through you and for God to show off his strength. And I think that natural weaknesses are probably the best places sometimes for God to get the glory in our lives. So don't despise the way God made you. Don't hate the way God made you. Instead, rejoice in and trust the way God made you and say, God, I can't do this well. I'm going to need you. I'm going to need you for this to be effective. I'm going to need you for this to work. So if you're incredibly wealthy, you can think I could just make it work. If you're incredibly socially adept, you can get people to do what you want. You can just, no, that's not the way to think. We think, God, I need you to make this work. And when it does work, when God uses it, it's so evident both to everyone else and to yourself. That was God. That was not me. That's what the giver gets the glory at that point. And it's not us. So I think that's a great lesson for all of us to learn. Jerry?
No, that's good. And I think I'm always amazed at his last few words there. I am content with weakness. It sounds like he delights in that. Insult, hardship, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. What a great thing to remember. We just need to review that in our minds because it's not natural for us to think like that, I don't think.
Well, I know we all know the story of Gideon. And I'm going to I don't know any of the numbers offhand, but he had tens of thousands of troops, and he's going to battle. And the Lord says, this is way too easy.
Yeah.
We're going to win this one so easy, Gideon. This is not going to work. We need to cut your troops down, right? And then whether they lap or drink out of the brook and all that. And eventually he cuts it down to what's the number?
300.
300. And so he's got 300 and he's going up against this huge group and they surround the camp and they break their pots and they hold up their torches and they shout. And everyone in the camp panics and they start destroying each other, right? And the Lord gets the victory. And the odds are so insanely stacked against God's people that God says, now's a perfect time for my strength to be made perfect in your weakness. And so that's a great narrative for us to go back to remember. In those moments, God is especially going to get the glory.
Because of those great, powerful weapons, torches and jars. You can get a lot with that going. But you're right. You're so right. And so we just have to turn our, not be so hamstrung by our weaknesses, but rejoice in them, delight in them, even enjoy them, thank the Lord for them, and then watch him use you.
Hey, just one more thing, Jerry, from you, and then I want to get Greg to get us to talk about the keys here in just a second.
I want to hear from Greg.
But just one more thing here. You've talked obviously about being paralyzed at 17, and we talked about your testimony. Just I want to give you a word on this because you've been forced into a place of unusual physical weakness that you didn't choose. God chose that for you in His sovereignty, and you had to learn to adjust to that. Can you say a word about God working through that weakness?
Yeah, and that certainly, at the beginning, it just looked like such a rough deal. But when I read this, that's certainly what it becomes. When through your weaknesses, that's when you become strong. And so that last verse there in 2 Corinthians 12, it's like that. And way, way, way more good comes out of the 40 years, or almost 40 now, of weakness than would have come from the whatever strength I had otherwise. Otherwise, God would not have brought that about. He wouldn't have ordained it unless it was the right thing and the best thing and the way God would be most glorified. And so, yeah, I don't think I would have guessed that it would have worked out at the beginning. It seemed like not a great thing, but a rougher thing. But now it just seems like I would not trade that for anything. And the daily weaknesses that go with that are, have turned out to be a good thing, not a bad thing. Now, I don't really remember that on a day-to-day. I need whoever comes up in the morning, Ben, tomorrow, to remind me of that. Like, quit being so cranky and read your Bible is what he needs to tell me. But that's...
I'm sure those would be the exact words.
Yeah, that's right. But that's... God certainly, His grace is sufficient. We know that. We know that, and He proves that daily through our weakness.